Hi guys, I've been getting frustrated recently about the number of different agentic frameworks coming out, and so I wanted to try and understand what's right for my purpose, and so hopefully I can share some of that knowledge with you about which agentic framework is good in which situations and how useful are each of them in a production setting. So first, let's take a look at how popular they are and when they were released. They were all released in a similar time, end of 2023 and the start of 2024. We've got Microsoft AutoGen, which is an open source framework but backed and supported by Microsoft. We've got CrewAI, which is open source again but is backed by deeplearning.ai and Andrew Ng. And lastly, we've got LangGraph, which is another open source framework, and this is made by the same people as LangChain. So those are the three we're going to be comparing, and how are we going to be comparing them? We're going to be using a star graph, and we'll score each of these frameworks against the points in this graph. There are a list of other assorted features which I'll go into now. The other features that I'm interested in is, do they support things like streaming? This is token or message streaming. Do they allow a human to be in the loop to make decisions? Do they support going back in time to see where your agent went wrong? Do they have any features to support memory? Is there a low-code GUI where you can create agents and have the code built for you? And lastly, which languages do they support? Right, now you know how we're going to score them. Let's get stuck in with the first one, AutoGen. So what is AutoGen? Firstly, the logo is awful. This looks like it was made in word art back in the 90s or noughties, so they really need to up their game there. AutoGen is based on the Actor framework, which is an asynchronous distributed communication system for software, which I think works really well for software because you can include as much complexity as possible inside one of these actors, and all that the other actors care about is how to send a message to that actor's inbox and how to deal with messages from their inbox. So that's the framework it's based on. And the way they build agents on top of that is that each of those actors is one agent where the agent has access to a number of tools and the ability to send messages and receive messages from other agents. And so the way AutoGen packages that up is you can create agents and then you can create conversations between agents that will keep going until a terminate is issued by one of those agents saying that the task has been completed to a satisfactory standard. That's how they work. What's the learning curve like for AutoGen? So I've gone on to their getting started page on their documentation and I've scrolled down to their quick start, and it seems that you can get started in about 6 lines of code. And given that their entire framework is based around these chats and creating these chats in a variety of different ways, there might be some additional config in terms of how the chat terminates, some extra agents going into the chat, and adding on any additional tools or logging, that sort of thing. But for the actual business logic of your agent, it's not going to get significantly more complex. There's no more concepts that you need to understand apart from these agents and these chats and the termination conditions. So I think the learning curve is very fast, and for that reason I'm going to give it a 10. So for integrations, I want to know how well it's performing at connecting with all different types of language models and also the tool ecosystem. So I've started by moving to this non-OpenAI models page on AutoGen's documentation. And so if we have a look at another language model like this light LLM with Ollama, then it's going to give us instructions for setting up this proxy server, which I think's in a lot of situations a bit of a cop-out. They don't want to have to deal with the integrations with multiple different language models, and so instead they're just saying we're only going to integrate with OpenAI standard, and if you want to use any other models then you're going to have to set up this local proxy server which forces it into OpenAI's fashion. So they can integrate with them, but it could be a pain if you're not using one of the major language models. In terms of the other integrations and ecosystems, they've got a page here called Ecosystem. It integrates with things like Composio, which are some tools you can use to connect with SaaS tools and products, Databricks, Ollama, Microsoft Fabric. There's PromptFlow. There's a lot of integrations with Microsoft products. A bit frustrating if you're using AWS. And finally, let's have a look at what their monitoring setup is. So they've said in here that they have partnered with Agent Ops, which is a language model and agentic monitoring SaaS tool. So that's a plus. It means you can monitor how much it's spending on your agents, where things are going wrong for debugging. Overall, taking those things into account, I'm going to give them a score of 6 Next up for AutoGen is scalability. How easy is it to first deploy and then scale a deployment of AutoGen? So I've gone over to the GitHub repo and I'm scrolling down to the key features section, and it says that it supports asynchronous messaging out the box. It is scalable and distributed. Now that sounds great, but when I then go onto their documentations page, it's showing that it wants to get started with AutoGen 0.2, which is the stable version, and is saying preview 0.4, a new event-driven asynchronous architecture for AutoGen. So that doesn't exactly give me confidence that their original version, which is stable, is currently event-driven and asynchronous. That being said, when I click on Get Started and head over to their documentation, there are asynchronous methods that are available. So perhaps their latest rollout, which I've tried to find more information on the internet, is just an improvement of their existing asynchronous service. AutoGen's actually based itself on the Actor model, which is an asynchronous messaging framework. So their entire framework is built on top of an async model of communication. Great, so for AutoGen, I'm going to be giving it a 7 because although it is based on this framework and it looks like it supports asynchronous messaging, there's clearly some issues, which is why they're upgrading to 0.4, and those issues aren't necessarily well documented. Right, design flexibility. So the Actor framework is great for asynchronous software systems where each actor is an API or a microservice responsible for a very small part of the overall system, but those responsibilities are clear and well defined. This allows flexibility then because you have complete control over what happens at each point. I think for language models, this is actually quite limiting, especially because you have limited flexibility in terms of how you design each agent here, and because the way that you set off the entire agentic system to complete your task is by just letting your system of agents run and then hoping they get to the right answer. I imagine it's quite difficult to modularize and systematically improve core sections. But I think there's a trade-off because they've made it so easy to use. There's always going to be a loss of flexibility and freedom, but for that reason, I'm going to be giving it a 4 for flexibility. So, on to documentation. I've headed over to the repo again. After a little bit of searching, they do have these icons that link to it, but I would have hoped that it was easier to find. When I then click on the documentation, I'm immediately hit by this choice. So this was a little bit confusing for me, but when we do click Get Started, there is then good documentation, and it's everything that you need to find is available there, from tutorials to get you started, installation. When I found the documentation, it was good, but because it was a little bit difficult to find and I wasn't sure which version to use, I'm going to be giving it a 7. Right, on to other features, starting with streaming. AutoGen does support streaming. It looks a little bit confusing and complex to set up, but what's interesting is that it supports both input and output streaming. So you can stream input from another agent and have it processed real time with a live stream coming back out, which I think may be increasingly important for real-time use cases and voice. Next up is human in the loop. AutoGen does support human in the loop, but it's quite constrained. There are only 3 options, either never, always, which means every single time a message is received from a language model, then the human is asked for an input, or terminate, which means the human is only asked for input when the agents want to complete their task, which I think is probably appropriate for this task-based agentic framework, but some other frameworks will support human in the loop during tool calls and during any part of execution. So I find this a little bit constraining, but they do support some human intervention. The languages supports are Python and .NET, which is unsurprising given it's a heavily Microsoft supported framework. None of the other larger agentic frameworks support C#. Next up, low-code tools for AutoGen. They do have their AutoGen Studio, which is a low-code interface, and it's open source, lots of ticks there. And actually, I think for AutoGen, this type of low-code interface is perfect because it's a much higher level of abstraction already. So as a programmer, I wouldn't feel too comfortable using it, but within a low-code interface to quickly get some sort of reasonable output, I can see that being particularly useful. The only other feature left to consider is time travel. AutoGen doesn't support time travel. You can't go back in time after a task has been completed by your agents and see what would have happened if you had changed the prompt or changed something halfway through the execution. So we've got support for streaming, we've got limited support for human in the loop, we've got support for a low-code framework, we don't have support for time travel, so I'm going to be giving this a 5 out of 10. Next up, we've got LangGraph. LangGraph is based on the Praegle and Apache Beam architectures. And so it's slightly different from the other two, CrewAI and AutoGen, in that this is a more generic framework rather than defining concepts like teams or crews or conversations as being core to their design. It's based on research, similar to how AutoGen is based on the Actor framework. This is based on Praegle and Apache Beam. The way that you create and use it from code is similar to NetworkX, if anyone's used that before, which is a graph library in Python. When you build graphs, they look a little bit like this. So you end up with nodes and edges that you can connect in any way that you see fit. Great, so what's the learning curve like? LangGraph is definitely harder to learn than the other frameworks, CrewAI and AutoGen, and that's because you have to know what agentic architecture you want to implement. There are plenty of options and there are good tutorials, but you need to fundamentally choose which architecture you're going for. Even if we're taking a look at their quick start guide, it is quite a long tutorial, and I believe people have had issues with LangGraph in the past because of its poor documentation, but in reality I don't think it's due to the poor documentation. I think just conceptually it's much harder to get your head around. But when you do become comfortable with it, it's a much more powerful framework that's more adaptable. So for learning curve, I'm going to give LangGraph a 3 because it is quite steep. Next up, we're going to look at the integrations for LangGraph. Now, because LangGraph is a graph framework and each node is code, it can technically integrate with anything that's written in Python or JavaScript. So really, there's no limit to its integrations. That being said, it does integrate fully with LangChain because they're part of the same company. They have their own monitoring stack, LangSmith and LangChain, which do work particularly well for LangGraph. However, if you decided not to use LangChain, you wouldn't be limited in your ability to use LangGraph to do so. And because of that flexibility, I'm going to give it a 8 for integrations. On to scalability and deployability. LangGraph has full support for async out of the box. It's based on Praegle and Apache Beam, which means I trust it a little bit more for when it's scaling. It's a little bit more complex with LangGraph than AutoGen because they've got state to support, but you can access the state at any point for persistence, and so it's still suitable for serverless architectures like AWS Lambda or Azure Function Apps. And lastly, I think it's more scalable than something like AutoGen because of its design flexibility. Because you can decide what goes into a node and what goes into an edge, you can design your units so that they are reusable or that you can combine them more easily with other components. And after you've tested this one bit, you can then have more faith that it's going to continue working as you expect, which allows you then to expand your architecture into doing more complex things. So for those reasons, I'm going to be giving LangGraph a 9 for its scalability and deployability. So next up, design flexibility. Now LangGraph is a true framework built on top of network graphs and doesn't directly connect to language models itself, which means it has complete freedom. You can implement architectures like routers, React agents, reflection agents, and anything that you need for your workflow. You can even design your graph to work in exactly the same way as AutoGen or CrewAI because it is that flexible. But that comes with the trade-off of it requiring more code, it being harder to learn, and a more difficult concept. So that's the trade-off. But for the complete flexibility you have, for design flexibility, I'll be giving LangGraph a 10. Documentation, how good is LangGraph? So I've gone on to the LangChain/LangGraph website, and it seems quite straightforward. Resources, docs. So if we go docs, LangGraph, and we go straight into a quick start tutorial, how-to guides, conceptual guides, reference. Now, LangGraph has had a lot of slack early on for its poor documentation, but I think they've, personally having been a user over the last few months, I think they've taken it on board and the documentation is much better now. In addition, there's now a course that they've hosted so you can take to get started, get set up and understand all the core features, which I think really really helps. So for that reason, for documentation, I'll be giving LangGraph an 8. Other features supported by LangGraph. So starting with streaming, LangGraph comes with first-class support for streaming, so that's a big tick. You can also do streaming for either messages or tokens, depending on what your needs are. So moving on to a low-code tool, there is LangGraph Studio. However, this is just a custom IDE for developing LangGraph-based applications rather than a true low-code tool. In terms of LangGraph, is supported in both JavaScript and Python. So they've focused on the two main scripting languages. LangGraph does support human in the loop, and they have a very flexible setup for this, where at any point during the graph execution, you can request a human input and the execution will be paused until that human input has been received. So we've got full support for human in the loop. LangGraph also support time travel. So that means you can go back in time to understand what's gone wrong, explore alternatives. So that's good news as well. So overall, we've got streaming, human in the loop, 2 languages supported, JavaScript and Python. We've got time travel. The only thing we don't have is a true low-code studios. I'm not going to penalize it too much for that, so I'm going to give it an 8. Next up is CrewAI. How does it work? CrewAI creates an agentic abstraction as a crew. Within your crew, you have any number of agents. Agents in CrewAI are language models with tools associated with them and also roles. So it might be a software developer or a copywriter. And each of these agents can have a conversation with themselves to try and complete tasks. And there could be any number of tasks to complete within the crew. And the way that the crew goes about allocating those tasks and handing them off to other agents is with a process that you can choose. So you can link tasks to agents and determine whether or not tasks can be executed in parallel or independently. So that's a very high level overview of how it works. Now let's take a look at how steep the learning curve is and how easy is it to get stuck in. So what's the learning curve like on CrewAI? Well, compared to AutoGen, there are a few more concepts to understand. You've got to understand your agents, the tools, what processes are, tasks, and how they all tie together. But it is quite fast to get started. They've got a quick start and it's much shorter than LangGraph. Within 6 chunks of code, you can then have your crew kicked off and trying to complete the tasks that you've defined already in YAML files. And I quite like that about this, the fact that you can define your agents in YAML, that you can define your tasks in a YAML file as well. This makes it particularly good as a task-based agentic framework. For learning curve, I'm going to put it above LangGraph and below AutoGen with a score of 7. So next up is integrations. It integrates with LangChain directly, so any tools that you can create in LangChain you can use with your crews. So that's a big bonus. They've also got a load of extra tools here that they integrate with. Composio, which is quite a large library and have loads of connections with Google and other SaaS products. Firecrawl is a good scraping tool for converting websites into markdown files for use. And I particularly like this YouTube video search. So they've got some quite specific tools that might be relevant for your project. In terms of monitoring, there are a few different monitoring frameworks that they support. They've got Langtrace, OpenLit, and Portkey. I quite like the fact they integrate with OpenLit because this is an open source tool, which unlike LangGraph, which integrates with Langsmith, you can log to OpenLit and host your observability for free. So that's a big plus for me. And given you can actually replace agents inside CrewAI with code, so you could use a LangGraph agent as part of the multi-agent orchestration. I'm going to put it on the same rung as LangGraph and give it an 8. Next up, CrewAI and how scalable and easy is it to run in a distributed setting. So you can execute your crews and tasks asynchronously, which is particularly useful. So CrewAI does have a feature called memory, which might not be as easy to scale because it uses a local SQLite database. So you might well then need to set up your own SQL database and pass it in and scale that separately. However, they also have a separate external memory provider called Mem0, so you could use that instead. In terms of scalability, for if you wanted to do something increasingly complex and the tasks that you want to do, then I think you might run into some limitations, but you definitely have more flexibility and ability to scale with this level of abstraction with tasks and crews and agents than you do with AutoGen. So I'm going to put it between AutoGen and LangGraph and give it an 8. So how flexible is CrewAI? It's primarily a task-based agent framework. So you have to decompose what you need out of your agentic system into tasks. And if the problem you're trying to solve doesn't fit so neatly into tasks, is more messy, or you might need something more custom, or even if you don't want a task engine tool and you want something to build and instead you want a conversational agent, then CrewAI might be limiting and might become difficult to use. That being said, I think you have more flexibility because you've got these other components with agents, crews, tasks and processes than AutoGen. So I'm going to rate it above AutoGen and below LangGraph at a 7. So how good is CrewAI's documentation? From my perspective, it looks pretty good. Their website is easy to navigate. It's got a consistent design, so it's easy on the eye. It's clearly separated into sections. Conceptual understanding is separate from getting started, and separate again from specific how-to guides for the purpose that you might be using CrewAI for. So that's really good. There's also a separate blog where you can look at what the community is asking for or learn from other people's mistakes. So that's a really nice touch. And there's also excellent courses on deeplearning.ai that I'd recommend if you're wanting to use CrewAI. So for me, I think CrewAI for its documentation is going to be at the top, and so I'm going to give it a 10. Right, so what other features has CrewAI got? Starting with streaming. It doesn't support streaming, but because it's a task-based agentic framework, I guess that's not as much of an issue. It does support human in the loop, but similar to AutoGen, it will only ask for human input at the end of a task before it finally returns the response to the user. So that could be a little bit limiting. It does offer time travel, so you can go back in time from the last kickoff, the last time your crew ran, and see what would happen if you change something. So that's a big plus. Something that CrewAI has out the box is memory. It supports short-term, long-term memory, user memory, and this is all baked into their framework, so it's quite easy to get set up with. You can just enable memory when you're setting off your crew, or enable long-term memory, short-term memory, entity memory separately. So that's a big plus for CrewAI. In terms of languages, at the moment it's only supported in Python. And lastly, low-code interface. So I went onto their website, and when you scroll down, it says that you can use their UI Studio to build their multi-agent automations, but I couldn't find actually where that UI Studio is. And when I Google it, you actually end up with this unofficial UI Studio called CreqAI Studio. So there is one that's built in Streamlit and allows you to create your crews, tasks, import them as required. So there is a low-code interface, and I think probably for CrewAI, low code will work really well in this setting because most of what you're writing in Python is actually just configuration. There's not a huge amount of architecture so much in terms of how you build things and how you connect them together. So no support for streaming, limited support for human in the loop. It does support time travel. It supports memory, which is a plus. Only supports Python and no official low code interface. So I'm going to be giving it a 7 for other features. So the results are in. How did we do? It's not a clear picture at all. What is clear is that AutoGen didn't perform as well, I think, on average compared to the others. If you're looking to tackle a task-based problem, and that's how you can represent things, or if you want something that's very fast to get started with, is easy to use, not too steep of a learning curve, and has got good integrations, I'd go with CrewAI personally. If you're looking for a task that's slightly more complex, or you need to work with JavaScript, or if you want it to be a conversational chatbot or voice agent, then I would personally go with LangGraph because of its support for streaming and its flexibility. If you need to work with .NET or Microsoft infrastructure, then I would recommend AutoGen because it's the only one that supports the .NET framework. I hope you've enjoyed this video on Agentic Frameworks. If you have, please like and subscribe as it'll motivate me to make more content. If you want to get in touch with me, you can reach out via LinkedIn or my Discord group, see below in the comments. Otherwise, thanks a lot for watching. Have a good day.